So let me just quickly inform you that we're having some technical difficulties with our webcasting. So what we're going to do is, of course, tape our session, and then as soon as we can, we'll start replaying it. We'll move right along then to the comment period. This is the time for members.
I would say, President Mr. Mayor, we just reporting out of closed session. No reportable action. Thank you.
Thank you. Now's the time for members of the public to address us on any issue not on the agenda. I have one request. I don't have any others. Ms. Deirdre Desjardins. Good afternoon.
Thank you. It's Deirdre Desjardins.
Yeah.
It's French. So I did not have a chance before the board passed their contract procurement policy to fully review it. And as I began reviewing it, it became apparent that it has a lot of exemptions that are not in the state contracting manual. I talked to an attorney with experience in state contract procurement, and she said, no, this doesn't appear to conform. It's a real issue. And I have asked, it's not me, the Delta community groups, North Delta Cares, Hood Community Council, Lock Management Association, Delta Chambers and Visitors Bureau, and Delta Defenders have asked Director Lipner to give the draft, your procurement policy, to the Department of General Services for review. And the reason this is important is because knowing violation of those statutes is a felony. And I don't want to be sending letters to your executive director. She's the one who's technically responsible. She's a very nice lady. She should not be having to get them. You need to be doing your bidding in conformance with the State Contract Act and with Government Code 4525. They're very clear, and I would request that you do that. Thank you.
Thank you. Excuse me, do we have a card? Oh. Thank you. OSHA, Missouri?
Good afternoon. Hi.
Yes, good afternoon.
My name, and I have 3 minutes, is that correct? Thanks. My name is OSHA Missouri. I'm with Local Agencies of the North Delta, which is a coalition of reclamation and water districts in the Northern Delta, about 17 of them. And I wanted to speak to you in the open period. I have some specific comments about agenda items, but you know, it's very concerning what's going on right now out in the field. DWR has been conducting investigatory drilling under the Supreme Court order. Unfortunately, on those 10 parcels that some of which DWR has been out to, and which obviously is affiliated with the kinds of activities that your entity is proposing to undertake as well, has failed to obtain the necessary county well permits in order to make sure that the well drilling is compliant with state standards and that it's mapped appropriately by the county and by the state for closure and for future reference. And so it's very frustrating for local people to see that DWR is excusing itself from the most basic requirements which do apply to the state. And I think in support of that conclusion, Sacramento County was able to go into court this morning and get a temporary restraining order stopping additional well drilling from occurring under the temporary entry permit. And I think it's important to note, too, that this is not a state supremacy issue because this is something that is a state requirement that applies to all state entities. And so, for instance, Caltrans for many years didn't get well permits, but after working with Sacramento County for several years to resolve it, decided that, oh yes, it should get the state permits. And ironically, it's DWR that maintains the database of wells. So this is very important to people for protection of the aquifer and other environmental standards. So I want you to be aware of what's going on with DWR because you are affiliated. And the other problem with it is that all the drilling that's occurring is in furtherance of a single tunnel option. And there's nothing about this drilling which is supporting better mitigation or dealing with community concerns. In addition, another failure of DWR was with respect to the drilling that has been occurring this week is that they didn't do site clearance for endangered species and nesting birds. And in fact, I found a nesting killdeer right on one of the sites where the drilling would be occurring, and I'll give you a handout that explains that. But this is very, it's a Migratory Bird Treaty Act protected bird. Very basic protections means you have environmental staff go out and try to clear the site, make sure you're not disturbing wildlife. So it's this kind of disregard for the community and for the environment that has kind of been par for the course in what's going on right now, and what we foresee and fear in any project going forward. And I know that the DCA has expressed concerns about this, but I think it's about time to actually make that happen on the ground. And I'll give you the handouts.
Thank you. Move right along to, I don't have any other requests to speak. We'll move right along to number 7, approval of minutes. 2 meetings. The first one is April 18th, regular meeting. Is there a motion for approval of those minutes?
Move approval of the minutes of April 18th.
Second?
Second.
Motion is second. Any questions? Those for motions?
I was not here, so I
Well, I'll
think
get to the,
okay, thank you.
those for motions say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Both say no.
Abstain.
Abstentions?
Abstain.
Then we'll move right, approved. We'll move right along to the May 18th minutes. A motion?
I move we approve.
Second.
Motion is second for approval. Any discussion? Those for the motion say aye.
Aye.
Opposed say no. Abstentions? Passes. Move right along to consent calendar. There being none, we'll go directly to 9. By the way, Ms. Meserve, you mentioned, did you want to address us on 9? I just want to know so I could write it down when I call people. It's okay, I just don't want to leave you out, but that's, when we get there, if you need to address us, you can do so. We'll move right along then to 9A. Consider passing resolution to authorize the president to execute an amendment to the joint exercise of powers agreement for planning and environmental services in support of the environmental analysis for potential Delta Conveyance project and to determine such actions are exempt from the California Environmental Quality Act.
Thank you, President Estramero. I'll be providing the staff report on this item. So this item was continued from the board's May meeting, but to help provide some background, on May 2nd of this year, DWR withdrew its approval of the Cal Water Fix project and rescinded its notice of determination under CEQA. In doing so, DWR indicated its intent to develop a notice of preparation. This notice is expected to consider proposals to address climate change resiliency and protect the State Water Project Delta Conveyance from earthquake risk in consideration of a one-tunnel conveyance consistent with the governor's executive order. This May 2nd notice further identified engineering design and similar work that the DCA is uniquely situated to provide as DWR moves through the CEQA process. For example, and as noted in the staff report, conceptual engineering services that the DCA can provide should help mitigate traffic noise and similar impacts. The item before you is an amendment to the JEPA, which will allow the DCA to provide the planning and environmental services to DWR as DWR moves through its CEQA process. It further deletes or suspends some inapplicable provisions of the JEPA during the environmental planning phase. At the May meeting, there was some confusion about the DCA's role during the CEQA process and the scope of the proposed amendment. To clarify, DWR is and will remain the lead agency under CEQA. With that, I'd be happy to answer any questions, and staff's recommendation is for the board to adopt the resolution approving the amendment and determining that is it exempt from CEQA. Thank you.
Thank you, Joshua. Any questions? Okay, if there are no questions, then we'll go to public comment. Supervisor Natoli. Good afternoon, Supervisor.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Estamera and members of the authority, thank you for the opportunity to address you this afternoon. I am Don Natoli, a member of the Sacramento County Board of Supervisors, also here on behalf of the Delta Counties Coalition, which includes the 5 Delta counties. I just wanted to make note that we were here a month ago. I appeared on behalf of the County Coalition and offered some comments at that time. We certainly appreciate the forward notice with today's agenda item and have had an opportunity to review that. I would just note that as you consider this item on your agenda here today, that please take into consideration as a part of the authorization that goes with this relative to budgetary authorization, but the substance of the work that's contemplated as a part of that work plan and the agreement that would provide the DCA with the authority to do so, that on behalf of the counties, we would ask respectfully, but certainly very seriously, that one, that consideration in the work that's being done in preparing for the environmental analyses that will follow on in the next year or two, that a serious consideration be given to alternatives as a part of that process, but also as that field work and the assaying and assessing of both the properties in the Delta, and I say properties, but certainly the aspects of the project as it might be considered, but also the various engineering and field work that goes on, that local processes and ordinances be adhered to. I think it was referenced here earlier. We think it's very important, and certainly we appreciate the outreach, some of that which is occurring over just the last few days, but also that the outreach to stakeholders, that's important, and I know Mr. Chairman and certainly members of the authority certainly have that as a discussion item on your agenda and did last month as well. But we would certainly, again, ask that as you look at alternatives, as you look at the conveyance aspects, but all that goes into that, the work with the local counties, but certainly the people and the landowners, that consideration be given very careful scrutiny, and that obviously taking into light the impacts, not only what might be proposed, but also making sure that the local ordinances and processes are adhered to. So we look forward to, again, the outreach that will occur as it contemplated, and that will continue to voice concerns, but also express our interest in making sure that the Delta is represented in both the decision-making, but also in the workups that will lend themselves to an informed discussion about what those alternatives might be in the future. So I thank you with that, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Supervisor. Catherine, did you want to respond to the comments?
No, thank you. We've had, I think, some productive meetings subsequent to the last board meeting with some of the county commissioners, and I think we're on the same page in terms of making sure that we are adequately funded to evaluate all alternatives that are identified in the process, and to make sure that issues that arise are addressed. So I think that's a big part of the transition we're taking here with this new budget.
Thank you, and we'll talk a little bit more about it when we get to the budget. Okay, and I have, yes, Ms. Meserve, and then I'll call the rest of the folks.
Oh,
Yes.
sorry. I was just trying to line
That's
up
all
to
right. Go
give you
ahead,
a
Nadine.
heads up. OSHA Meserve, local agencies of the North Delta. I think with respect to this agenda item 9A, my concern is that the conveyance project is still defined as a project that would convey water from Sacramento River north of the Delta directly to the existing pumps. So we really haven't expanded consideration to all the potential conveyance alternatives that may exist, and I think that's entirely inconsistent with the water resiliency portfolio initiative that the governor has ordered. I understand that this entity's focus may be on trying to find out more about the feasibility of a single tunnel, but I don't think it's appropriate for the scope of work to be so limited. For the entities and communities in the Northern Delta, it's really a non-starter to be placing this big of a facility. It doesn't really matter whether it's one tunnel or two. The amount of water that is, at least in the past, been proposed to be exported out of the northern part of the Delta before water is allowed to flow through and provide beneficial uses for agriculture, recreation, and wildlife. It will create unacceptable effects, both with water quality as well as footprint effects on the legacy communities in this area. So you've really boxed yourself in by having way too constrained of a definition of a conveyance project. And we'd like you to spend some time and effort looking at other types of conveyance projects. And I understand that maybe you believe that should be done by DWR, but it really doesn't seem very efficient for this entity to have a totally different process. And it really doesn't strike us as being very feasible that at some point some other type of conveyance would be considered if you guys are spending just in the next year $101 million working toward a single tunnel project. And just looking at the proposed budget in Exhibit B, you've even got $5 million toward property access and acquisition. So you're already proposing to move forward on this specific project and get the property to do this specific tunnel project. And so that's very concerning, and I think different and in conflict with what the governor has ordered, and I think that it's a misuse of your own agencies and state funds to spend that amount of money throwing it after something that we really believe will be infeasible and unacceptable, you know, and regardless of if you could make tiny changes to bringing more stuff in via barge versus truck or something like that, that's not going to fix the inherent problem in taking huge amounts of fresh water out of the northern part of the Delta. Thank you.
Thank you. I have Ms. Deirdre Desjardins.
Thank you. So this is a substantial amendment to the Joint Exercise of Powers Agreement. It has not been reviewed by the Department of General Services, Office of Legal Services, for conformance with applicable laws. And I believe that the approval of DGS is no longer applicable to this amendment for that reason. One of the concerns under the State Contract Act, you're required to have a project specification. You're deleting that. It may not be appropriate to combine a Joint Exercise of Powers Agreement to do planning where you don't know what the specifications are with an agreement to design and construct a facility that you no longer know what is. In addition, the Central Valley Project Act requires that DWR shall design any works constructed under the project. And very clearly, DWR is not designing the project in the Joint Exercise of Powers Agreement, and it's also a conflict with DWR being the lead agency. But it says under your 30, 70, and 100% design that you don't even necessarily offer those packages to DWR for approval. This is something that should have been addressed when it was first signed, but it is something I'm bringing up now. Another huge issue is deleting the permit terms. There's still a clause in the standard clause that requires that this body comply with all laws and regulations, and that includes local laws and regulations such as getting the well permits. I am informed that that duty is separate from DWR, and to the extent that the drilling that is being done is actually done under contract with the authority, you have, I believe, an independent duty to ensure that those permits are acquired. Finally, there is not sufficient funding for this. DWR says they will come up with $19 million and get reimbursed for it later. That's not in accordance with the Central Valley Project Act, at least as far as I understand. Your DWR is required to have sufficient funds at all times to pay for costs. So I would ask that this contract be given to DGS to review, and that it be reviewed carefully for accordance with all applicable laws before being signed. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Dan Whaley?
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon,
Dan Whaley,
sir.
Delta resident. I am extremely disappointed that after a discussion about a project that was rescinded, everyone has continued to go forward. This morning, the county and the state spent several $100,000 on lawyers to get a temporary restraining order to stop drilling. In several locations, people are out there standing around working. None of that had to occur if you guys did your job. Wade Crowfoot probably doesn't even understand that you are pressing forward with one tunnel without having reviewed the alternatives. You are likely setting yourselves up for a taxpayer lawsuit over the spending of this 93 million or 70 million, whatever money is spent. And so that ought to be considered before you continue to do things without a proper process. The governor promised to take a new look at this project. Have any of you taken a new look at this project? Or are we just putting our head down and doing exactly what we did a year ago? Because if that's what we're doing, then the result is going to be the same. There's going to be lawyers that are going to litigate this for years because you haven't started the process over in the way that you should. You haven't reached out to the communities to find out what the real impact is going to be. The same DWR people are out there in their pickup truck ready to drill instead of finding out what's really going on. It was shocking to me, it was shocking to the fire department chief that they were out there ready to drill when they hadn't even notified the fire department. There were half a dozen tags that said gas line below that they had just stabbed in the ground. And the potential danger to our community was real. And that's why the judge this morning granted a temporary restraining order. And we hope that you guys think about this before you go forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Whaley. Any further discussion?
President Shamir, I just want to
Questions? Yes.
respond to one of the questions that came up about the process.
Yes.
So if the board decides to approve this today, then it would go to DWR for approval. If DWR approves it, then it would go to DGS for approval, and that's the same process that was followed for the JEPA itself.
Thank you. Any questions?
So basically, what you're saying is that it would follow, maybe not in the same order that is being asked here, but it would follow the kind of the guidelines that people are asking for.
That's correct. Due to
in
our
this meeting.
understanding.
So we basically would have a meeting of the minds at that point.
That's correct.
I'll entertain a motion if there's no further questions.
I'll go ahead and move to support item 9A and adopt a resolution authorizing the president to execute an amendment to the joint exercise powers agreement for planning and environmental services to support the environmental analysis for a potential Delta conveyance project and to adopt the secret determination for such action.
Your second?
Second, I wanted to point out as I'm seconding this,
Yes.
that the DWR will be going through the CEQA process. We just don't have the same CEQA process for our end of it at this point. Is that correct?
That's correct. So the CEQA coverage for the actual work we're doing is because it's feasibility study, but that's in furtherance of DWR's CEQA process for consideration of a potential conveyance project or alternatives.
And then actually, I also just wanted to repeat for those who came up and spoke, because I very much respect your speaking, that it will obviously be coming up for review, maybe not in the order that they said, but it will definitely come up for a review before any action is really taken.
That's absolutely correct. Before any sort of project would be approved,
Okay, so I
that's
just
the
want
CEQA
everybody to be
process has
aware
to
of
be
that as
completed.
we go forward. So I've seconded it.
Anything further? Okay, those for motion say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, say no. Abstentions? Okay, motion carries. 9B, consider pass a resolution to revise the scope of services for Jacobs Engineering Group Incorporated and authorize the executive director to negotiate and execute an amendment to consultant services agreement to provide engineering design management services.
Thank you.
Yes, Kathy.
Yes, so I have a PowerPoint presentation that I'd like to go through with you to walk you through the change in scope of services for the engineering design manager to address this pivot that we've taken to redo the environmental planning process. So back in November of 2018, the board approved the selection of Jacobs Engineering, and there was an award of a $93 million contract over a 5-year period. As with most of our contracts, they start with an issuing a task order, which was done in January of this year for $7.1 million for startup services. It was for approximately 7 months, first 7 months of startup services. In March, as a result of the governor's announcement, task order number 1 was revised for the first time to place on hold the services that were in the original task order and added a task to assess impacts of a single tunnel. The current action that I have before you today is task order number 1, Rev 2, to reconcile the services from the governor's announcement and the need to start reinitiating some of the tasks that were in the original task order, and then a task order number 2 for their planned services in fiscal year 19 and 20. I think with the engineering contracts, because this is going to be a iterative process, we don't know what the alternatives are on the table, that we will come to you year to year to year to go through what their scope of services and budgets requests will be for the next year. So this represents getting us through this fiscal year, the 2-month period, and then next year for Jacob. So in the original contract was approximately just over $7 million, as I said, over a 7-month period, and was revised. Money in the budgets of the first 6 tasks were trimmed, and an additional task was added for assessing the single tunnel scheme. And then what we're asking for here is we have reconciled the budgets, and we have begun to ramp up the engineering services, and are coming back to you to close out this fiscal year with about $5.3 million in services from the EDM. As for the upcoming fiscal year, and this reset of the environmental planning work in support of DWR, the Jacobs Engineering Design Manager team will be supporting us in program management support, schedule risk, document controls type support, the programmatic work that they need to do. A significant amount of engineering work will be done, the alternative analysis and concept engineering reports that need to feed into the EIR, EIS process. And we are providing an environmental liaison between our group and the DWR so that any questions that they have that require engineering input, we get them, and right now we bring it up to the 4th floor so they can make sure that they have that analysis. But we want to make sure that the liaison piece is really important, to make sure that they're getting the engineering information they need to do the EIS, EIR work, and that our engineers are producing impacts analysis and mitigation analysis necessary to support this process. And then the team will be coordinating a lot of the field work, coordinating surveying work, coordinating geotechnical exploration work, and then we'll also have a significant role in the stakeholder engagement in terms of for all of the alternatives on the table, producing documents and presenting the technical information in a public forum so that people can comment and engage and interact. So we'll also be, the DWR has asked us to provide facilitation support as part of that contract as well, and some graphic support. So that's essentially what they will be doing in the upcoming fiscal year. The total contract amount or task order for fiscal year 2019-2020 is approximately $38.6 million. So the staff recommends you consider passing resolution of this revised scope of services and authorize myself to negotiate and execute an amendment to their services for both this fiscal year's work and next fiscal year's work.
I'll make a motion to adopt that resolution.
Second.
Second.
Questions? That's some public comment, so we'll go to public comment. Ms. Deidre Desjardins on 9B.
Yeah, so under the joint exercise of powers agreement, the DCA, not DWR, is directing the design of the project. And I assume that's reflected in the contract terms for Jacobs. This is a conflict of interest to the extent that you're doing environmental planning services for DWR, and DWR is the lead agency. There's just, it's not appropriate. It appears on the face of it to not be appropriate to do that as an add-on contract because of a conflict. Thank you.
Mr. Whaley?
I already said my
Okay.
same thing I just told you previously. I think Mr. Wilson would like to
Go ahead.
Thank you.
Mr. Mark
My name
Wilson.
is Mark Wilson,
Good afternoon, sir.
Wilson Farms and Vineyards, Clarksburg. From everything I'm hearing about these changes and so forth, and OSHA Reserve talked about it earlier, it sounds like it's the same project, but a single tunnel in the same location and so forth. And my observation is that a couple of observations, you were directed to look at one tunnel by the governor, but I don't remember that direction was specifically to have it in the same location based on the same type of project that WaterFix was. And it looks to me like you're talking about boxing yourself in to the alternative in the same place, basically the same project, just with one tunnel. And now that I'm listening to some of this project stuff, is the drilling that's being done, the exploratory drilling right now, being done through one of your field work contracts? The reason I didn't comment earlier was because it says only things within the authority's jurisdiction. And so it's not one of your work contracts, it's DWR's.
That's correct.
Thank you.
Yeah, as for alternatives, you know, the process will identify alternatives. We aren't wedded to the current alternative that was approved in the previous one. In fact, I think you will see In my executive report that we're starting to look at the Ship Canal. We think there's some routes maybe along the I-5 corridor. We will have a stakeholder process, and we'll engage the counties and the community in identifying alternatives that need to be assessed as part of the EIS EIR. Come back in 6 months and
Yeah.
see if we've
Could I just make a quick comment? I think part of the problem is we're kind of rapidly, May 2nd, there was the statements were made and the orders were put out, and we're still responding to them. And so it's still necessary to start to look at different alternatives, but you haven't given us a chance to do it yet. So we're still in process. So we need to keep continuing to talk to each other and interacting with each other, but the process is still in play. I mean, in terms of looking at alternatives, in terms of looking to see what we may be doing with a project. So it's not engraved in stone yet, and I think that that's really important to remember.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson, for your comments. Okay, any other questions on this agreement? There's a motion and a second. Those for motion say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed say no. Abstentions? Okay, motion passes. Move right along to 9C. Consider approving the budget amendment number 2 for fiscal year 2018, 2019. We have it in our packet.
Right. Again, I have a PowerPoint presentation for you. I thought it best that we try to clean up the fiscal year 2018, 2019, given the significant changes that we have experienced. So just to go through the history, the original budget that was approved by this board anticipated a significant ramp up, and $133 million was approved. An amendment 1 came before you addressing delays in the permitting and the slower ramp-up progress, and it was a $61.4 million budget. There was the governor's order to rescind the project and look at a single tunnel. And so we were put on hold, and now we are ramping back up to support the environmental planning effort that DWR is doing. So a bit of a roller coaster. If I look at the original adopted budget and what was anticipated, of the $133 million, there was a significant amount of engineering construction that was about to start. It was amended in, when was that amendment? It was before my time, actually.
Oh,
I don't remember when that was. I should have had it on here.
got it.
What was it?
I think it was in
December? Okay, yeah. Perfect. And acknowledged that there was a slower start and construction wouldn't be starting in this fiscal year. It was knocked down to around $62 million. Right now, we are forecasting 14.25 here for the fiscal year. No money budgeted for construction, land acquisition, or mitigation contingency. The program management, ramping the program up, and legal and treasury. The environmental was spent prior to this new ramp up, so that's money that was spent before the new order. And then ramping up the engineering management work at 6.5. So we plan to close out this year's fiscal year somewhere around 14 million. We're trending below that number now. So I thought it important to redo the budget given the dramatic changes in where we were and where we are now.
Could I just point out something? So basically then that's no land acquisition this
No.
fiscal year at all?
Nope. There will not be any until we have a project.
Right, exactly. And I
Correct.
think that that's really important for
Yes.
everybody to be aware of.
Yeah. All right. And I can just briefly show you the From July of last year, when the budget was first approved, we were ramping up. The engineering design manager came on board in January of this year, and they were ramping up. The order came out, and we then tried to finish what we were in the middle of and ramp back down. And then you see in June of this year, we're starting to ramp back up. So that gives you a cumulative sense of the overall budget here and how it's been spent on a monthly basis. I think this is, yeah, so for the last 2 months that we're forecasting is another 3.8 million, mostly in engineering ramp-up and program management. So it's staff's recommendation that you consider approving budget amendment number 2 for the fiscal year 2018-2019 period.
I'll make that motion.
Second?
Motion and second, any further discussion, questions? Those for the motion say aye.
Aye.
Opposed say no. Abstentions? Motion passes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. We'll move right along then to our next item. D is consider adopting the 2019-20 proposed budget.
All right, again, I've prepared PowerPoint number 3 for you.
Death by PowerPoint.
Hopefully this is a good way to communicate this information for the audience and for you as well. So I just want to, the key activities for 2019 and 2020 are largely around establishing the governance of the DCA, preparing our project management plans, policies, procedures, and training staff on compliance. As a new authority, this is critically important that we have a comprehensive set of policies and procedures around the way that we function and operate and do our business. We're also going to be building our project controls and reporting capacity, building master schedules and budgets that we can then use for reporting in this forum and posting publicly on our website, building our risk management, document management system, payments, contracts, et cetera. And as I said, just beefing up the information that we're including in our reporting, especially as we ramp up the amount of expenditures that we'll be having. We also will be serving as the engineering support to DWR. We'll be doing a lot of field work and engineering analysis necessary to identify and assess and minimize impacts, evaluating all alternatives that come out of the process and doing much more comprehensive engineering documentation of those alternatives. Preparing the concept engineering reports for the draft EIR, EIS, and then coordinating with DWR and state water contractors and review and comment on all of our work products. As part of their role, DWR is who we will be designing and handing this project over to, so their involvement in the design review is extremely important. And we also will be supporting the stakeholder engagement process. A lot of complicated technical information on the various alternatives. We'll be preparing presentations, animations, visualizations that we bring to the public meeting so that people can understand the facilities that are being proposed in each of these alternatives and can facilitate commenting in an easier fashion because it's more understandable. No engineering drawings, but using more animations and renders to explain these facilities, I think would be extremely helpful. We also want to make sure that every question that is asked in these stakeholder engagement and public forums are recorded, and the answer is also recorded and put into a database that's searchable so that everyone can see what the technical responses are to the questions that are being asked. So that's a large part of what we will be doing in the upcoming year. Our budget for the year is, we're requesting $97.8 million, $82 million of budget with approximately $16.8 million in contingency. No contingency will be spent without coming before you seeking permission to transition from contingency into a line item. The most of the money will be spent on the engineering, as I pointed out, doing the engineering work around any of the alternatives that are identified, also doing a lot of the field work. When I read through all of the comments that came out of the last process, particularly from the counties, it was fairly easy to see where some of the gaps in the engineering work were from the previous work, and a significant amount of it would benefit from some geotechnical work around how we might construct with precast members, how we might minimize noise during boring. So, and any alternative that we look at, the more geotechnical information that we have, the more that we can better define the facility. So there'll be a significant amount of field work that we do for all of the alternatives. Property access and acquisition, as you said, we won't be acquiring any property this year, but that money is allocated for the temporary access permits for any of the field work that we do, and the stakeholder engagement. And the office administration, there's a significant amount here in this upcoming year because we will be moving into a permanent office. Our lease will be up in the office that we have from DWR. It'll also be an opportunity for all of us to work together. DWR and ourselves working on the EAS will all be in the same space, so it'll be easier for us to communicate, collaborate, and make sure issues are being addressed in a really expeditious way. So that's a summary of the budget. For program management, that's the executive director's office. All of the governance, implementation, our legal counsel, treasury, insurance, annual audit roll up to this number. Again, there's a significant chunk this year around building up our policies and procedures for the authority. Program controls include schedule and budget management, risk, all the reporting, payment, processing, document controls, procurement, and we will be launching a project management information system that will have detailed records of all cost transactions. In the engineering, we have the chief engineer's office, all the alternative analysis and concept engineering reports that feed into the environmental process. A significant budget here. I've heard people loudly and clearly, and I've seen it in the record and reviewing all of the technical work that's been done in the past. My goal is to do as much engineering as is needed to answer the questions and to right-size all of the facilities and make sure that the commitments on the project are embedded into the documents so that it's actually in the drafts and final EIR and EISs. Field work will include mostly geotech, engineering work, and exploration work, and some survey and mapping for all of the alternatives. Property access, as I said before, it's mostly around the access permissions and permits for the field work support. Stakeholder engagement is our communications manager, facilitation services, engineering support, meeting support for the meetings that will be hosted out in the stakeholder engagement process. And then the office administration, our relocation, lease, office supplies, HR support, IT support, and software. So that's an overview of our budget. And staff is recommending that you approve our budget request for the fiscal year 1920.
Yes, sir.
I don't know if we have public comment on that.
Yeah, we do have a couple, but
No,
want
that
to
was
take
it.
questions first? No
Nope.
questions? Then, Ms. Meserve, you want to address this?
Thank you. I just wanted to comment on the budget. We've heard a little earlier in the meeting that we're being asked to kind of give you guys a chance to show us how you're really going to be looking at alternatives seriously. And I just have to say, you know, I've been working on CEQA processes for nearly 20 years in both, you know, helping agencies get projects through and also challenging projects, both working on writing EIRs and all that. And really, the EIR is often too late to really consider alternatives. I mean, even the EIR that was set aside in May, you know, there was a lot of time and pages spent on looking at and rejecting before they were further considered alternatives. And there are pages and pages about why a lot of the things that we think might meet water supply needs and ecosystem needs and also respect the delta as a place could not be adopted. So I think it's a little bit of an empty promise to say you'll do that inside of CEQA. I think what would be more persuasive to the community would be some kind of commitments around whether this entity will be willing to look at and help do preliminary engineering around some of the alternatives that we and others would suggest to actually see if they would work. Because, you know, the kind of dollars you guys are talking about here, the community and the local people and environmental groups that are, you know, both local and international that have been involved in this process for the past 10 plus years, we don't have those kind of funds. So we may tell you, oh, we really think you should look at an intake in the Western Delta during high flows or something like that. But, you know, it's not rational to say, oh, we should have to try to engineer that. But if you guys seriously are trying to look at ways to meet your water supply needs of your constituent agencies, then we want to see some of these dollars spent on engineering and development of these other types of alternatives that could have a lot less impact on both the ecosystem and the communities of the Delta, and in particular be designed to work during high flows and not be designed to take water during low flows, which is exactly what we saw with this last project. And we haven't seen anything yet, and you know, we obviously will give time, and time will pass and things will be developed. But I would urge you to actually put dollar values out of each of these categories in your budget that's going to go towards analyzing and developing alternatives. Because if, you know, my guess would be that 95% plus of the dollars I see in this list here are going to be spent on the single tunnel alternative. And if that's the case, then, you know, we just don't have that much to talk about. So, you know, why don't you see if you can impress us? Thanks.
Thank you. Ms. Jardine?
Yes, I have real concern that the climate change, the hydrodynamic modeling, you need to do 3D hydrodynamic modeling with sea level rise and with North Delta levee failures. That has never been done for this project. Delta Stewardship Council told DWR that they did not use best available science. It may be that you have to move the intakes north of Freeport if this is even going to function as a project for mitigation of sea level rise. You have not done that modeling. For that reason, it's crazy to go spend the kind of money you're spending on design level geotechnical drilling for an intake at Cortland. You know, while Hood is at 14 feet elevation, the Sacramento River goes down considerably below sea level, and if you have high sea level rise and levee failure, you will get salinity intrusion at low flows. And you simply have never evaluated that. The same thing you have not evaluated that would validate the design is the hydraulic design of intakes. That was recommended to be done a while ago. You've never validated that you can have 1,000+ foot long intake and that it will work in that location. It may be too tidal. I testified about this in the water fix hearing. It may not work at the bypass flows that you want to provide. And you need to go in, you need to do that modeling before you've invested all this money in a design that was never adequately validated. You have been told that the science was vetted on this. I used to work at Los Alamos Lab, NASA Ames Research Center, the Santa Fe Institute for Complex Systems Theory, and it is simply, it does not pass the smell test. When it was designed in 2010, they did a single analysis of sea level rise, and it was just a kludge. They took a model of levee failure in the South Delta in an earthquake and just kludged it to try to do sea level rise. The shoreline changes. The Delta Independent Science Board has also asked for this modeling. If you are serious about doing mitigation for sea level rise, you have to do this before going and drilling in Cortland for the intake location.
Thank you. Mr. Wilson, just come on.
I'm seeing stuff in the budget about the stakeholder outreach, and it brings to mind the process we've already been through. And what I'm gathering from hearing about the stakeholder outreach is what we've seen in the past, and that's that the plans or the projects are designed and defined, and then they ask the stakeholders, the Delta stakeholders afterwards, well, what do you think about it, when they've already invested all this time and all this money into developing these plans. One of the things that, one of the flaws of the last go-around was the stakeholders were just plain, the Delta stakeholders were just plain excluded from the process, other than to have check-the-box public meetings to say, hey, we have a few boards around the room, this is what we're talking about, tell us what you think, see you later, it's over. My proposal would be that the stakeholders should actually be subsidized to be in the process, by the process, with the organizations and individuals that professionals that we have, and non-professionals, that are stakeholders in the Delta actually be part of the planning process to figure out what the alternatives are, and also to be part of writing when a project is picked, to actually be part of that process as well, not just be there later on to say, well, what do you think about it? So that's my proposal. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. Any discussion, any further discussion or questions?
Yeah. Yeah, I do have a
Yes,
comment.
Steve?
So, we want to be supportive of the agenda that this budget lays out. But at the same time, I am going to make a request for a future budget, future agenda item regarding the timing of the expenditures.
Sure. That'd be a cash flow curve for the year.
I'll make it during future agenda items. That being said, I'll move approval of the motion.
Steve, that request could be included in our treasurer's report at our meetings. We could just attach it to the treasurer's report, so we
Okay.
have, so as long as it's clear, and then we could have a good report. Okay. There's a second?
Sure.
Palmer?
Second.
Okay. All right, a motion to second then for approval. Those for the motion say aye.
Aye.
Opposed say no. Abstentions? Okay, motion passes. Have the two budgets, and now we're on E, 9E. Considering passing resolution to authorize the executive director to negotiate and execute a lease for office space at 980 989th Street in Sacramento.
Thank you. As we've discussed, we are looking to lease approximately 26,000 square feet at 989th Street, which is just around the corner here. We'll put desking in there for ultimately 150 people. In the short term, it will be the location for the DCA, the DCO, which includes the engineering and program management teams, as well as the environmental team on the DWR side, so that we're all working and co-located, working collaboratively together. So last 2 months, we've negotiated this lease and seek your approval to sign the lease pending minor legal modifications that are still pending.
I'll make a motion to go ahead and approve it, and want to compliment the staff, legal counsel, everybody's been involved with this process of finding a suitable office location. It's been quite a process, and I think you did an outstanding job.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'd like to second that. Also been talking to some of the people about the AV and all that kind of stuff, and I am impressed with the folks, how they're working on this one.
Steve, any comments?
No comments.
Okay, great. And I just want to say, not just for this item, but for all the items. I know it's a thick agenda packet, but I appreciate the fact that we publish everything and folks can look at everything that we look at. I think it's very important that we share with the community what it is that we're doing.
Well, I also wanted to say something like that about sharing with the community. I am impressed with the quality of the comments that are made by the public, and we have to take those to heart, obviously.
Yes, and I think we may have some responses in the CEO's report to some of the comments that have been made. But as we go along, we'll be able to respond to a lot of the comments as we actually do a project. We're way far from that. So I think some of the quietness you see from us is, well, you know, when we get to a project, we got something to talk about. So
Yeah,
I think
we're still readjusting.
yeah, I think that's what's happening up here. We're all very talkative, so it's not that we've lost our tongues. We just need a project to talk about. So, all right, motion and second. Those for motion say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed say no. Abstentions? Motion passes. Thank you, Councilman. Move right along then to consider passing resolution to amend bylaws regarding meeting times and staffing flexibility. Joshua?
Thank you. So the bylaws are required by the Joint Powers Agreement, and the board initially adopted bylaws in August of 2018. Staff is requesting this item 2 cleanup changes. The first is to the meeting time identified in the bylaws. It's currently set as at 2 p.m. for regular meetings. We've actually been starting at 1:30 if we have a closed session, so we'd request that get cleaned up. Of course, if for some reason we wanted to, have a closed session from 1:30 to 2 and then adjourn to open session, then go back into closed session, we could, or alternatively, if the board wished, we could always, modify those timelines. The second is related to DCA staffing. So both the Joint Powers Agreement and the JEPA as amended provide maximum flexibility to the DCA on staffing. The bylaws do not. Specifically, they limit the executive director to be a member agency employee or an independent contractor. The bylaws are also largely silent on the terms of any DCA direct employees. So what we'd request in this amendment is to provide some additional and maximum flexibility to the DCA. So we would clarify that the executive director can be a DCA employee, a member agency employee, or an independent contractor. Also clarify that DCA employees, if any, are at the will and report to the executive director, except of course the executive director, which is always reports directly to the board. And then just as noted in both the staff report for this item and in the executive director's report, staff has been evaluating some future recommendations on potential DCA staffing models, which would likely include making some position DCA employees, but that will be brought back to you for a future approval. This is just a bylaws cleanup to give us flexibility if we decide to go in that route.
Sure. I'll make a motion in support, but I just wanted to clarify the point that our counsel, Joshua, just made about coming back to the board. I just want to be clear that we've had a lot of discussion over the last year about having DCA employees and all that, and I just want to be assured that any action of hiring anybody to be an employee would come back to the board. We want to discuss that because all the complications with CalPERS and the other employee contracts, et cetera.
Absolutely no. This is simply to amend the bylaws so that the board has maximum flexibility on how you might decide to staff the DCA.
Good.
Great.
Okay.
Any other
Second.
questions? Okay, motion and second to approve the resolution. Any questions? Okay, those for the motion say aye.
Aye.
Opposed say no. Motion carries. And then we'll go right along to the executive director's report.
All right, you have a copy of it. I just want to point out a couple of highlights of work that we've done over the last month. To start, I attended several meetings with Secretary Crowfoot, Carla Namath at DWR with the Delta County Commissioners Coalition and Restore the Delta. I'm open to meet with any and all groups that reach out, but I think we're starting to start a conversation and trying to create a framework of how we communicate and engage on this process. Parsons has started their work. We initiated a very aggressive 90-day plan to get our critical policies and procedures drafted. On the engineering side, we've combed through the historical record. We've identified significant gaps in previous conceptual engineering work, so we're starting to fill those gaps. We know there is at least one alternative on the table, and that's the past one with a single tunnel. So whatever gaps we had there, they're going to be good to fill now. We've started to collect some preliminary information on the feasibility of using the ship canal as an alternative, and we're looking forward to any other alternatives that are identified around conveyance for us to just begin collecting some preliminary information, mostly so when we go into the stakeholder engagement, there's information there that's available to everyone to provide comment. And then we've spent a lot of time over the last month pulling together the budgets for your reviews and approval. So those are the key things over the last month. And very much looking forward to getting into our new building because we're all kind of sitting on each other's laps in the existing one right now.
I had a tour of that building
Yeah.
today. Not the new one, but the old one, and yes,
Yeah, it's a bit
time.
crowded.
It's crowded and depressing.
So if anyone has any questions?
Questions? No. Thank you, Catherine. Move right along to the General Counsel's report.
Thank you. So the bulk of our time was spent this month on action items on the agenda, but I won't go through those. I did want to note a couple of things that were not action items. The first is actually one that's not noted in my report, and that relates to the Environmental Committee, which the board discussed at your last meeting. Earlier this week, we had a teleconference with President Estremera, DCA staff, and DWR staff about trying to put together a potential framework of what an environmental committee and what a stakeholder, that portion of the stakeholder process would might look like. And so our hope is to put together sort of a straw person proposal for the board to consider and review at its July or potentially August meetings. In addition, we've been working with Catherine and her staff on some of the IT procurements, which will be coming forward in future months. And then also starting the process to work with Parsons. As Catherine mentioned during the budget process, they're starting kind of putting together the policies and procedures and getting the agency sort of stood up. And we will be assisting in that process. That's all I had. Be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Questions?
No, it's all good.
Okay, Treasurer's report.
Good afternoon, President Estremera and members of the board. The Treasurer's report is in your packet, and I just wanted to highlight that as of May 31st, 2019, the DCA has cash balance of $803,475. I would also like to add that as of on June 13th, we received reimbursement for invoice number 10 for about $656,000, and I wanted to let you know that the DCA is submitting batch invoices more frequently to the DCO now, so
Great.
the process should get a little bit better. Okay. Thank you, that's all I have, and if you have any questions.
Any questions?
No, good report.
Thank you, Brenda.
Thank you.
All right, great. We'll move right along to any verbal reports. Seeing none. Any future agenda items?
Yes, sir, President Estremera.
You did, Steve.
I do have a request for a future agenda item.
Yes.
Request that we add a future agenda item for next month for the executive director to provide a report on how the projected monthly expenses for task orders issued under approved contracts compare to available funds from DWR and as they come in from participating state water contractors. We need to be
Yep.
careful with the timing of the expenditures.
Yep.
Yeah.
And ensure that funds are available before they are committed. Some state water contractors will not be returning to their boards to seek approval to provide funding for the DCA planning and environmental work until after the notice of preparation has been issued. So we need to be cognizant of that.
Correct. Yep, I can do that.
Okay, the CEO will do that. Any other ones? Okay, so we'll move right along then to adjournment. Thank all of you, and we'll be streaming eventually. Thank you again for attending the meeting.